Hey guys, so now we're gonna look at the final part of chapter 3, and so far we've been looking at demand, which is the buyer side of the market. We've been looking at supply, which is the seller side of the market, and now we're going to join buyers and sellers together, because after all, buyers and sellers together make up the market, right? So the first thing we need to understand is what we call equilibrium, right? And in economics, equilibrium is basically when buyers and sellers agree on a set price, okay, and a set quantity which is bought or sold. Okay, so when buyers and sellers in the market agree together, right, we say the economy is, or the market is basically at equilibrium. And equilibrium is where everything basically balances out. Okay, so we always want to be at the point of equilibrium. Okay, and in equilibrium, we actually know what the equilibrium price is. Okay, so the equilibrium price is something you guys really need to know and is really important. Essentially, the equilibrium price is the price at which the quantity demanded, right, the amount that buyers want to buy, basically equals the quantity supplied, the amount sellers want to sell. Okay, so sellers want to sell at a particular price and buyers basically want to buy at the same price. Okay, so that is the equilibrium price. And then you have the equilibrium quantity, which is the quantity bought and sold at the equilibrium price. Okay, so the quantity or the amount that buyers or consumers want to buy and the amount that sellers or suppliers want to sell are basically always equal at the equilibrium price. Okay, so the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity are two things that you need to know. Equilibrium basically is also the sweet spot in economics. Okay, so the sweet spot, right? And when we say the sweet spot, is like you always want to hit the sweet spot. You always want to be at the point of equilibrium because everything is balanced out. Everything clears out, right? So that is where most economists want to be, okay? So prices basically adjust when you don't hit the point of equilibrium, okay? Prices tend to adjust till you get to the point of equilibrium, okay? So that is the whole concept of market equilibrium. Think of market equilibrium as the point where quantity bought and quantity sold are essentially equal. Okay, so now let's take a look at an example of equilibrium. Okay, so again, we're looking at our energy bar market. Okay, and again, like I said, in equilibrium or in any market, we always have supply and we always have demand, which are basically together. Okay, so equilibrium price, right, which is 150 in this case, and equilibrium quantity, which is 10 in this case, is always the point where the supply curve intersects the demand curve. Okay, where the supply curve basically meets the demand curve, and then we have equilibrium. Okay, so with this example, at a price of 50 cents, a lot of people want to buy energy bars because they're so cheap, but nobody is willing to sell energy bars. At a price of $1, you have 15 people demanding energy bars and you have only 6 sellers, right? Or the quantity being supplied being 6, right? In this case, our equilibrium price is actually $1.50 because at $1.50, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Okay, so our equilibrium price is $1.50 and our equilibrium quantity is basically 10. Okay, at a price of $2, well, we have quantity demanded less than quantity supplied. And at a price of $2.50, we have quantity demanded being 5 and quantity supplied being 15. Okay, so that is how equilibrium actually looks like in the market. Okay, you have your demand and supply. Okay, so you have demand, which is downward sloping, you have supply, which is upward sloping, and equilibrium is the point where they basically intersect. So you have your equilibrium price, I'll call it P star, and you have your equilibrium quantity, I'll basically call it Q star. Okay, so essentially that is what equilibrium looks like. Okay, and like I said, the market itself is basically a price regulator. Okay, so suppose, right, the price of energy bar is basically $2. Okay, at this price, quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. There are more people willing to sell energy bars than there are people willing to buy energy bars. Okay, there are 13 people willing to sell energy bars and there are only 7 people willing to buy energy bars. Okay, so in that sense, there's gonna be a surplus in the market. Okay, because you have 13 minus 7 and that will give you positive 6. Okay, right. So that is a surplus in the market, and that price happens above the equilibrium price, okay? That price happens above the equilibrium price, okay? So above the equilibrium price, there's always a surplus in the market, okay? Above the equilibrium price, there's always going to be a surplus in the market. So at this point, there's a surplus. At this point, there's basically a surplus, right? Remember, equilibrium price is the point where, or our equilibrium point is where basically supply intersects demand, and we have it at 150, and we have the quantity basically at 10, okay? In this case, our quantity demanded, right, is basically 2. No, it's basically 7. Sorry about that. And our quantity supplied is basically 13, okay? So then we have an excess of 6 million energy bars, okay? So everything is quoted in millions, so you can't just say 6 energy bars, okay? So that is what happens, right, when you actually have price set above the equilibrium price, okay? So long as price is above the equilibrium price, where I'm showing you all these lines, there's always going to be a surplus, okay? There's always going to be a surplus. Quantity supplied is always going to be greater than quantity demanded, okay? Likewise, you can actually have a shortage in the market, okay? So let's take a look at an example. If price of a bar is basically $1, you have more people willing to buy an energy bar than there are sellers willing to sell an energy bar, okay? So quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. So you basically have a shortage of 9 energy bars, so -9, so that's 15 minus 6, okay? So you have a shortage of 9, right? And it happens always when the price is below the equilibrium price, okay? So shortages in a market always happen when price is artificially set below the equilibrium price, okay? So in this case, we have price set at 1, okay? So we have supply being 6 only, and we have quantity demanded being 15, okay? So quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, meaning that there's more people willing to buy energy bars than there are energy bars floating around to be sold. So there's a shortage of essentially 9 million energy bars, or you can just say 9, okay? So in that sense, every time price is below the market equilibrium, there's always going to be a shortage. Why? Because quantity demanded is always going to exceed quantity supplied, okay? Right. Now, the market basically corrects itself, okay? So when there's a surplus, okay? When there's a surplus, the market eventually will correct itself to get to the point of equilibrium. And when there's a shortage, the market itself will correct itself to get to the point of equilibrium, okay? And again, in the example, equilibrium is basically the point where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, and in this case we have 150, okay? So in this case we basically have 150, right? So that is where we have equilibrium. Quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, as there's no shortage or there's no surplus as well, okay? So there's no shortage, neither is there any surplus. Basically, we call it market clearing condition, okay? Market clearing condition, meaning the market clears. In economics, or economists, we always want to be at a market clearing condition. We don't want a shortage and we don't want a surplus. It's not efficient in any way, okay? So now we go to price adjustments, and price adjustments, right? Basically, the market corrects itself, okay? So if price is above the equilibrium price, we actually have a surplus, okay? So in this example, at $2, we actually had a surplus of 6 billion bars, okay? So long as price is above equilibrium price, we always have a surplus because quantity supplied is more than quantity demanded, okay? So basically, producers have more than they can get rid of, or they have more products or goods than they can actually sell, right? So to actually sell the extra goods they have, they'll actually bid price down, okay? And as they bid price down, quantity demanded actually increases till buyers and sellers get to basically the point of equilibrium, okay? So when there's a surplus, price is forced down, okay, till you basically get to the point of equilibrium, okay? And also, Conversely, if there's a shortage, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. Okay, so there's a shortage in the market, so producers know there's a shortage in the market. They know people are desperate, so they basically bid up price, right? And quantity demanded actually falls till the shortage is basically closed, or the gap is closed, and you again get to the point of equilibrium. Okay, so now when there's a shortage in the market corrects itself by forcing prices up. Okay, and when there's a surplus in the market corrects itself by forcing prices down. Okay, now you can actually do a class activity. So this is a demand and supply schedule for potato chips, right? So we have the price of potato chips, and we have the quantity demanded and quantity supplied of potato chips. So you need to find the equilibrium price and quantity. And if chips were 60 cents a bag, describe the situation in the market for chips and explain what will happen to the price of chips, essentially. Okay, so that is what you guys need to do. Probably pause the video here and try and find the answer. What is the equilibrium price and quantity? And if chips were 60 cents a bag, describe the situation in the market for chips and explain what happened to the price of chips. Okay. Okay, so the answer is to find the equilibrium price and quantity is the point where quantity demanded basically equals quantity supplied. And we have that scenario only over here. So the equilibrium quantity is going to be 130. And the equilibrium price is basically going to be 80 cents. Okay. Now, if chips were 60 cents a bag, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, okay, by basically 40 bags, right? So there are more people willing to actually buy a potato chip than there are sellers willing to sell a potato chip in the market, okay? So there's a shortage of 40 potato chips or 40 bags, right? And in that sense, because the market has to correct itself, prices will actually increase till they get to basically 80 cents. Okay, so the price will actually increase till it gets to 80 cents. So now we know demand and supply, and we basically know market equilibrium. We can also predict changes in price and quantity, right? So if an event occurs, for example, if there's a shortage of oil, what will happen to the price of oil? What will happen to the quantity bought of oil? Okay, right. So if some event occurs, right, we need to know what will happen to equilibrium price, and we need to know what will happen to equilibrium quantity. And we need to do the following three things, okay? So basically, these three things are going to be cheat codes for you, okay? First of all, if some event occurs, you need to know what will happen to which curve, okay? Is the demand curve going to be affected, or is the supply curve going to be affected, okay? Then you need to decide the direction the curve will shift. Will the curve shift to the left, or the curve will shift to the right, okay? And third, you need to compare the old equilibrium price and quantity to the new equilibrium price and quantity, okay? All right, so if an event occurs, first, know which curve will be affected. Is the event affecting the demand curve, or is the event affecting the supply curve, okay? Decide the direction the curve will shift. Will it shift to the left, or will it shift to the right? And compare the old equilibrium price and quantity to the new equilibrium price and quantity, okay? So the first thing we're going to take a look at is basically an increase in demand, okay? So when there's an increase in demand, where does the demand curve shift? The demand curve will shift to the right. Yes, you're correct, okay? So the demand curve will shift to the right. Okay, so again, we're going to compare the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium. So this is our old equilibrium point A. We'll compare to the new equilibrium point over here. Again, equilibrium is the point where demand intersects supply. So we have point B, right? And we'll look at what happens to price, and we'll look at what happens to quantity, okay? So in our example, when demand increases, okay, comparing the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium point, okay, price increases from $1.50 to $2.50, and quantity increases from 10 to 15. Okay, so when there's an increase in demand, price increases and quantity increases as well. Okay, so that is with an increase in demand. Okay, price will always increase and quantity will increase as well. Okay, when there's a decrease in demand, what direction does the demand curve shift? Yes, the demand curve is going to shift to the left. Okay, so again, we have an entirely new demand curve, and again, we need to compare the old equilibrium, which is point A, to the new equilibrium, which is point B. Okay, and by comparing it, we actually see that there's a change in price and there's also a change in quantity. Okay, so in our example, comparing the old equilibrium, which is point A, to the new equilibrium, which is point B, right? Prices fall from $2.50 to $1.50, and quantity decreases from 15 to basically 10. Okay, so when there's a decrease in demand, equilibrium price will fall and equilibrium quantity also falls. Okay, so that has to do with a decrease in demand. Okay, that has to do with a decrease in demand, right? Okay, and then we have an increase in supply. Okay, we have an increase in supply. So an increase in supply, what direction does the supply curve shift? The supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, so the supply curve will shift to the right, and again you have the old equilibrium point and you have a new equilibrium point, and you basically compare the old equilibrium point to the new equilibrium point. Okay, so you have $1.50, and then you have the new equilibrium point, and you have a new equilibrium at being $1. Okay, so when there's an increase in supply, prices decrease and quantity increases. Okay, equilibrium price falls, but equilibrium quantity increases. Okay, so that is an increase in supply. Okay, then we have a decrease in supply. A decrease in supply will have the supply curve shifting to the left. Okay, so a decrease in supply, the supply curve will shift to the left. And again, we compare the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium point. So this is the old one to the new equilibrium point. Okay, and we see what happens to price. Okay, so price actually increases and quantity actually decreases. Okay, so comparing the old one to the new one, price increases and quantity decreases. Okay, so when there's a decrease in supply, equilibrium price increases, but equilibrium quantity actually falls. Right, what about if both demand and supply change in the same direction? Okay, when demand and supply change in the same direction, right, so we have a new demand curve, and then all of a sudden we have a new supply curve. For some reason supply changes, we have an entirely new equilibrium point. Okay, and with this one it becomes a bit ambiguous. We don't really know what happens to price, because remember, an increase in demand has to do with an increase in price, but an increase in supply has to do with a decrease in price. So we don't really know what direction price changes. It depends on the magnitude of the change. Okay, but what we do know is that when demand increases, quantity increases, and when supply increases, quantity increases. Okay, so an increase in demand and an increase in supply will always lead to an increase in the equilibrium quantity. Okay, but the equilibrium change in price is a bit uncertain. We're not really sure what happens to price essentially. Okay, we're not really sure what happens to price essentially. Okay, And what about a decrease in both supply and demand? Okay, a decrease in demand, we know that price will decrease, okay, and there's a leftward shift of the demand curve. And a decrease in supply, we know that the supply curve will shift to the left, okay, right. But then again, we know that a decrease in supply and a decrease in demand will always lead to a decrease in equilibrium quantity, but a decrease in demand leads to a fall in price, and a decrease in supply leads to an increase in price. So it's a bit ambiguous. We don't know what will happen to price, okay? So price is uncertain, okay? So the change in equilibrium price is uncertain because the decrease in demand lowers the price and the decrease in supply raises the price, right? So it depends on the magnitude of the shift. But we do know that quantity will always decrease, okay? Quantity is always going to decrease. Right? What if demand and supply change in opposite directions? Okay, a decrease in demand and an increase in supply will always lower the equilibrium price. Why? Because we know that a decrease in demand has to do with a leftward shift of the demand curve, and an increase in supply has to do with a rightward shift of the demand curve. A decrease in demand lowers the price, an increase in supply lowers the price. So we know that the price is always going to decrease, okay? But we don't really know what will happen to equilibrium quantity, because remember, a decrease in demand, okay, actually decreases quantity, but an increase in supply actually increases quantity, okay? So the change in equilibrium quantity is uncertain, okay? We're not sure what is going to happen. But we know that a decrease in demand will always decrease price, and an increase in supply will always decrease price. So we know for a fact that equilibrium price is always going to be lowered, okay? Equilibrium price is always going to be lowered. And then finally, what about an increase in demand? So an increase in demand, we know that it will shift the demand curve to the right, okay? And a decrease in supply will shift the supply curve to the left. We know that a decrease in supply will always raise the equilibrium price, and an increase in demand will always raise the equilibrium price, okay? So we know in that case that price will always increase when there's an increase in demand and a decrease in supply, okay? Prices is always going to increase. But we're not really sure about quantity again, okay? We're not sure about quantity again. Why? Because we know that a decrease in supply decreases quantity, and an increase in demand actually increases quantity. So we're not really sure about what happens to quantity. Again, it depends on the magnitude of the change, okay? Right. So this basically ends our chapter 3. I'm going to post the homework later on today, and I'm going to post a discussion question later on today. If you guys have any questions about the video, something you didn't understand, any concepts you didn't understand, please don't hesitate to ask me, okay? Thank you very much. See you later.